Welcome to Lecture 4. This lecture builds directly upon the previous one. In this case, we're going to assume that there is a vacancy on the Supreme Court that must be filled. This is a very timely topic since we've had a recent vacancy on the Supreme Court to fill the seat left open after Justice Scalia's unexpected death in 2016. If you were paying attention to politics then, you might recall that then President Obama quickly nominated Merrick Garland to fill the seat. But the Senate stalled until after the 2016 election, allowing President Trump to appoint Justice Neil Gorsuch to the nation's highest bench. As that political battle illustrates, the implications for selecting a person to join the Supreme Court are tremendous. So to discuss that issue, there are several questions that motivate the lecture today, like what factors influence who a president selects to fill the vacancy during what is appropriately called the selection stage of the judicial process. In this lecture, we will discuss the nomination or selection process for Supreme Court justices, and in doing so, we will discuss the president's strategic actions in choosing a Supreme Court nominee. We'll consider who influences the president's selections and what types of characteristics of potential justices matter during the selection and nomination stage. We'll examine each stage of the selection process and describe the roles that other institutional actors like the Department of Justice and the American Bar Association play during this stage. We will conclude by briefly contrasting this process with the selection of lower federal court judges and with the selection of judges in state courts. Just for fun, before we dive in, take a second to think about what qualities and characteristics or qualifications you think ought to be required in order for a person to be considered for a job as a Supreme Court justice or a federal judge. What minimum requirements do you think that the Constitution provides? Just take a guess here, looking at whether or not you think that a Supreme Court justice should be a natural-born citizen or have some sort of minimum judicial experience or have another sort of educational qualification. We know in Article 2, for example, that the Article 2 of the Constitution, that the president is required to be a natural-born citizen. Do you think the same citizenship requirement applies to the judicial bench? It might make sense to require that federal judges and Supreme Court justices have some background experience necessary for a job, or at a minimum to possess a law degree. Some of these seem like pretty basic minimum requirements, but if you guessed that none of these are constitutional requirements, then you'd be right. As a fairly constant theme this semester, the Constitution doesn't tell us a whole lot about this process or about what characteristics a president ought to consider when nominating a person to the federal bench. In fact, Article 2, Section 2 only specifies that the president appoint Supreme Court justices by and with the advice and consent of the Senate. And that's it. Article 2 doesn't give us a lot of guidance, but it does suggest that this will be a two-step process. And so we'll break this into two distinct lectures. In this one, we'll focus on the president's role in the appointment and nomination decision. And then we'll talk more about the Senate's role in the next lecture. In light of Justice Scalia's death in 2016, the tension between these two stages of the process came to a head when Senate leadership vowed to block any potential nominee that President Obama selected, and President Obama proceeded with his constitutional duty to nominate a person to fill the vacancy on the court anyway. Some of the Republican candidates for president in 2016 went so far to say it was an abuse of presidential authority for Obama to make a nomination in the last year of his term. That's a baseless constitutional argument. There is no such requirement in the Constitution. But the Senate is right that the president can't do it alone. In order for a nominee to fill Justice Scalia's vacated seat, the Senate had to vote to confirm. Thus, the interrelationship between the president and the Senate are of crucial importance here. And we'll focus a lot on how the composition of the Senate shapes the president's selection decision and therefore the selection process. All right, so despite limited constitutional instruction, the nomination and confirmation processes of the court have remained relatively stable over time. Because presidential appointments to the Supreme Court carry a great deal of weight, the process begins with an informal vetting procedure of potential nominees, typically before a vacancy even occurs on the court. As President George W. Bush succinctly summarizes, quote, "While White House staff and cabinet appointments are crucial to decision-making, they are temporary. Judicial appointments are for life. Because Supreme Court justices serve lifetime appointments, who the president chooses to put on the court can continue to influence the shape of public policy long after the president leaves office. Presidents are limited to 2 terms in office, but no such limitation is placed on the justices. Recall that many justices routinely serve appointments that are 2 or 3 times the length of presidential terms. For example, before he retired in 2010, Justice John Paul Stevens served on the court for a whopping 35 years after he was appointed by President Ford in 1975. While Stevens' tenure is not the norm, it should be clear that presidents recognize the long-term implications of Supreme Court nominations, and thus the appointment process is a task they relish. And although presidents must technically wait for a vacancy to occur before they start the search for a nominee, today most presidents enter the White House with a shortlist of potential nominees already in their early stages. But the real search for a Supreme Court nominee does not occur until after a seat on the court is vacated, typically through death or retirement. While presidents are not really in control of when a vacancy occurs on the court, this is certainly not to say that presidents haven't tried to exert effort to subtly or not so subtly encourage justices to retire or resign from service on the court. President Lyndon Johnson was especially active in this regard. In 1965, LBJ wanted to appoint his friend, Abe Fortas, to the court, but there was no vacancy. So LBJ appointed sitting Justice Arthur Goldberg to an alternate position as an ambassador to the United Nations. LBJ then pressured Goldberg to accept that nomination, which he reluctantly did. LBJ then had the freedom to quickly appoint Fortas as his replacement. Just 2 years later, in 1967, LBJ was at it again. This time, he wanted to nominate Thurgood Marshall as the first African-American justice to the Supreme Court. To create another vacancy, LBJ appointed the son of sitting Justice Tom Clark to become his Attorney General. With Clark's son acting as Attorney General for the administration, Justice Clark had to step aside because of conflict of interest concerns. Thus, another seat opened up and Thurgood Marshall was appointed to the court. Well, LBJ provides an interesting historical anecdote about presidential shenanigans. As you should remember from the last lecture, most vacancies are not driven by presidential manipulation. Instead, in the 20th century, most vacancies were created through voluntary retirement and unexpected death while in office, like Rehnquist in 2005 and obviously Scalia in 2016. After a vacancy occurs, with consultation from a variety of sources, which we'll talk about in just a moment, the president selects a potential nominee, and that nominee is subjected to go under an extensive formal vetting process. All nominees undergo an FBI background check, though history suggests that we shouldn't put a whole lot of faith in these. The background check on nominee Harold Carswell failed to uncover evidence of both his apparent racism and his affairs while he was married, and the background check for nominee Douglas Ginsburg failed to uncover the fact that he used to smoke pot with his law students. But the FBI does the background check, and then they turn over the report to the Department of Justice. And it's the Department of Justice's job to compile a full report on that nominee that includes not only the FBI's findings, but also the results from a comprehensive questionnaire that each nominee is required to submit. This vetting process can take quite a bit of time, especially since the FBI has slowed down in order to overcome some of its historical embarrassments. As a result, in an expedited time frame, like the one that Obama faced when he was trying to pick someone before he left office, a president has the incentive to select a person who has already been vetted for a position in the lower federal courts. In addition to governmental vetting, one institutional actor that has been a varying degree of importance in the vetting process is the American Bar Association, or the ABA. The ABA has something called the Standing Committee on the Federal Judiciary, which consists of 15 members from within the federal circuit courts and one at-large member. The members of the Standing Committee are appointed by the ABA president, and they serve a two-year term limit, where appointments to the committee are staggered in 3-year increments. The Standing Committee on the Federal Judiciary evaluates Supreme Court nominees based on professional experience, integrity, and judicial temperament. Based on these criteria, the ABA rates the nominee as well qualified, qualified, or not qualified, though the exact titles of the ratings have changed a bit over time. The ABA then reports the outcome and the number of votes obtained for that outcome. The ABA ratings have been used broadly by presidents across the ideological spectrum. Indeed, Nixon wouldn't put forward a nominee without ABA support. He also used the ABA ratings strategically by submitting a female candidate he knew was not qualified, knowing that the ABA would flag her as such. That way, it appeared that Nixon was considering a woman for a vacancy on the Supreme Court without ever actually giving her a real chance of getting onto the court, without making it through the Senate confirmation process. Despite the prominence of the ABA ratings in the selection stage, some have been critical of the ABA and accused the committee of having an ideological liberal bias. After controlling for numerous indicators of a nominee's experience, a Democratic president's nominee has a 55% chance of being deemed well qualified, while a Republican president's nominee only has a 40% chance of being rated as well qualified. These accusations of ideological bias led George W. Bush to change the presidential reliance on ABA ratings in March 2001. Rather than give the ABA a heads up about the nomination, Bush let the ABA find out the same way everybody else did, through his public announcement of the nomination. However, in March 2009, Obama reversed the Bush-era policy and restored the ABA to its previous quasi-formal role in the vetting process. Trump, again, reversed the Obama-era policy and, like Bush, does not allow the ABA to vet candidates before publicly announcing them. Once the nominee has been thoroughly and formally vetted, the president makes an official announcement of the nomination. While many factors in the selection stage are beyond the president's control, like the timing of the vacancy or the balance of power in the Senate, the president generally has control over when the announcement is made. This is the first time that the president publicly offers support for the nominee, though he might continue to make public appeals to shore up support for his nominee during the Senate hearings, which is the next stage in the process. After the president's formal announcement, the Department of Justice submits the materials to the Senate Judiciary Committee, which is the nominee's next stop in the process. As a preview of what's to come, the Senate Judiciary Committee then holds hearings for the nominee. Since 1946, the hearings have occurred in public. Prior to that point, the hearings were in private within the committee, or no hearings were held at all. But since the second half of the 20th century, confirmation hearings have become a mainstay of the selection process. Importantly, the Senate Judiciary Committee does not have gatekeeping abilities for Supreme Court nominees. That is to say that the committees can choose to recommend confirmation or not of a nominee for the Supreme Court, but this is merely a recommendation and does not carry any real weight when the nominee is put to the Senate floor for a vote. However, in the 7 times that a nominee received an unfavorable recommendation from the Judiciary Committee since 1870, only 2 of them managed to get confirmed, and both of those were in the 19th century. So the Senate Judiciary Committee may choose to send the nominee to the floor for a vote without a recommendation at all, like they did with Clarence Thomas in 1991, but whatever the Senate Judiciary Committee decides to recommend or not seems to carry a lot of weight during the Senate floor vote. After the Senate Judiciary Committee renders its recommendation, the nominee is put to the floor for a vote in the Senate, where confirmation occurs by simple majority, so 50% plus 1 of voting members present. Again, we'll spend an entire lecture on this next time for both the Supreme Court and the lower courts, but I think it's helpful to put the selection stage into its larger context debate here. The most interesting part of the nomination story is about the factors that influence who presidents ultimately decide to appoint to the court. To understand how the president makes such a decision, we need to back up to the formation of the shortlist. We know that incoming presidents frequently have a fledgling shortlist of potential nominees, but that shortlist becomes increasingly important once there's an actual vacancy on the court. The development of a shortlist is nothing short of a team effort. But whose advice is the president prone to take? In other words, how do potential nominees end up on the shortlist to begin with? Political scientist Christine Nemetschek set out to answer this very question in 2007. She went on a major data gathering mission, compiling the shortlists for each president, beginning with Herbert Hoover's appointment of Chief Justice Charles Evan Hughes in 1930 through President George W. Bush's selection of Samuel Alito in 2005. Interestingly, while we always refer to the shortlist, there typically isn't actually a physical record of the list of potential nominees. So to figure out who the presidents were considering, Nemetschek sifted through the private papers of each president to compile an exhaustive list. In the end, she found that for the 39 nominations made to the Supreme Court from 1930 to 2005, there were a total of 240 candidates considered for these nominations. In her systematic analysis, Nemetschek finds evidence that suggestions from members of Congress often catch the attention of the president. More specifically, senators in leadership positions are more influential than rank-and-file senators or suggestions that come from members of the House of Representatives. In fact, the president is 4 times more likely to listen to a Senate leader than to a simple rank-and-file member in the House. But even the influence of the most powerful senators has its limits. The president is less likely to listen to suggestions from senators when the president is politically strong. The president is 1/3 as likely to take suggestions from senators when the president's party has a supermajority in the Senate. So basically, when the president is strong and he has party support, then he doesn't need to seek suggestions from members of Congress because he's pretty confident that whoever he picks is going to make it through the Senate confirmation process. Conversely, the president is far more likely to listen to suggestions from Congress when he has low public support. When the president is not popular with the American public, he's 1.5 times more likely to take advice from members of Congress than when he enjoys high approval ratings. Nemetschek's analysis also reveals that there is variation in how tight-knit of a team the president is willing to accept advice from. Some presidents rely heavily and almost exclusively on their own internal White House advisors. On the other hand, some presidents have a much more decentralized decision-making process and broaden their circle of influence to work closely with the Department of Justice in developing a shortlist. Presidents who seem to embrace unilateral power by issuing more executive orders are more likely to have a centralized decision-making process, relying more heavily on White House advisors and excluding the Department of Justice. Unsurprisingly, in divided government, which means that the president and Congress are controlled by opposing party, this leads to greater centralization within the White House. As a result, under divided government, the body of decision makers is smaller and closer to the president. There also seems to be a systematic difference between Democratic and Republican presidents, where Democrats are less likely to go broad than are Republicans. So Democrats seem to keep a tighter-knit circle working with their White House advisors. Republicans seem to seek advice from more people. Once the president has a short list of potential nominees, his staffers go to work to gather as much information about the candidates as possible. It is from this list of potential nominees that a president will typically select an appointee. Given the lasting impacts of a nomination decision, we might reasonably expect that a president considers a variety of factors in his decision-making process. In an ideal world, the president would like to select a nominee who reflects his or her own ideological policy preferences to continue the president's legacy on the court. However, it is not a perfect world, and in making a choice, presidents often face different types of uncertainty. The first type of uncertainty is about the nominee. Very simply, the president cannot be sure how a potential nominee will behave when he or she ascends to the court. Because justices serve lifetime appointments, the president doesn't have the authority to remove a nominee from the court if he is displeased with that justice's behavior. So it serves the president well to select a nominee whose future behavior the president can feel most confidently about. The second type of uncertainty is about the Senate's confirmation decision. Recall that any selection the president makes must pass through the Senate's confirmation hearing. So the president must be conscious of the preferences of the Senate as well. Supreme Court nominations are especially vulnerable to the whims of the Senate during divided government, which again means the Senate is controlled by the opposite party of the president. In fact, in divided government, nominees have been confirmed only 55% of the time, while the success rate in unified government leaps to 88%. Another critical component that shapes the nomination and confirmation procedures is the ideology or the policy preferences of the nominees themselves. Presidents quite obviously want to appoint a nominee who is of his or her own political persuasion. This has been true since our nation's founding. For example, George Washington suggested that a number of factors were important in his consideration of Supreme Court nominees, but at the top of the list was a requirement that his nominees support his view of the new Constitution. And indeed, each of his appointees ascribed to the Federalist view that Washington held. That trend continues today, where conservative George W. Bush sought to appoint nominees that expressed his particular brand of judicial restraint, and liberal President Barack Obama sought to appoint nominees who espoused liberal positions. Although there is some debate in political science about when and how a justice's own policy preferences come into play, as we'll see much later this semester, there is widespread agreement that ideology matters on the Supreme Court. Thus, a president has a major incentive to understand the policy preferences of potential nominees, since this is an important predictor of that justice's future behavior on the court. The uncertainty over nominees' future behavior, as well as the uncertainty of the Senate's confirmation decision, coupled with the importance of ideology, structure the choice set for the president. In her study, Christine Nemechek argues that while all presidents face uncertainty, they can act strategically in the selection process to lessen the uncertainty by pursuing one of two strategies. An informational strategy is one where the president appoints a nominee about whom he has maximum confidence about their future behavior as indicated by the nominee's past actions, or a political strategy where the president acts in such a way to reduce conflict with the Senate. In both of these strategies, several factors influence which potential nominee the president will pick from his shortlist. Stories about presidents who have screwed up their Supreme Court nominations tend to get a lot of play. For example, President Eisenhower referred to Earl Warren and Bill Brennan as the two biggest mistakes he ever made, and President Truman once said that Tom Clark, his nominee to the Supreme Court, was, quote, the dumbest man I think I've ever run across. But for the most part, presidents try to get the decision right. One such way a president can minimize uncertainty about the future actions of a Supreme Court nominee is to appoint someone who has espoused ideological preferences that align with the president before the nomination. For example, the president can look to the potential nominee's past voting records and written opinions if that nominee has previous judicial experience. Then when selecting a candidate from the shortlist, the president can choose the nominee who is closest to his own ideological views. And indeed, statistical analysis reveals that this is true. A potential nominee is 45% less likely to be picked when he or she is at an average ideological distance from a president, as opposed to potential nominees who are aligned most closely with the president. Another way that presidents can seek to reduce uncertainty about the nominee is to appoint someone that they know well on either a personal or professional level. George W. Bush's failed appointment of Harriet Miers certainly falls into this category and is perhaps the most famous example, but there is a long history of presidents selecting nominees from their circle of friends or political allies. President Eisenhower promised Earl Warren, who had been the governor of California, the next spot on the court, and JFK nominated Byron White after White helped with campaign organization in Colorado. Finally, perhaps the best way to ascertain a potential nominees' preferences before appointment is to look at their past judicial or public service. If candidates were politically active, presidents might have an even clearer sense about the nominees' true beliefs, attitudes, and preferences. And in fact, presidents tend to appoint nominees that have demonstrable judicial experience. Most nominees have served on lower federal courts. With the exception of Obama's appointment of Elena Kagan in 2010, every current Supreme Court justice, and every justice since 1986, in fact, had experience as a federal circuit court judge. It's apparent then that there are certain factors that a president can look to when making the selection decision to try to appoint a justice that most resembles his own policy preferences and desires to shape the court. But the president doesn't make a decision in a vacuum. Indeed, because the nomination must survive the Senate confirmation, sometimes the president's choice faces institutional constraints. We know that in periods of unified government, the president has more flexibility to choose a nominee because it's very likely that his co-partisans will support his choice. But in periods of divided government, when the president faces opposition with the Senate, sometimes other factors come into play. When facing a hostile Senate, the president will undoubtedly want to select a candidate that appears to be objectively well qualified. So choosing someone with a solid track record of judicial experience is useful. But the president is also more likely to select a nominee with a limited paper trail, where the ideological preferences of the nominee are not so entirely well known, because such candidates will have a harder time securing confirmation. So it's a fine line to balance. Empirical evidence suggests that nominees who have been politically active, like in campaigns and such, are 15 times less likely to be selected from a short list than those who were not politically active. An example illustrates these political factors well. When Republican President George H.W. Bush had to select a nominee to replace retiring Justice Bill Brennan, the Senate was controlled by Democrats, so he faced a potentially hostile institutional environment. When making the selection, he seriously considered two candidates. The first was Judge Edith Holland Jones from the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. Jones was a well-known, solidly conservative judge with a very long paper trail detailing her conservative decisions on the lower court. And while this undoubtedly made her appealing to Bush, Senate Democrats were also certainly aware of her conservative track record, and so it was likely she would face a major confirmation battle in the Senate, making her potential nomination a liability. Bush also considered David Souter from New Hampshire, who was a lesser-known judge with a much, much shorter paper trail. Thus, while Bush did not have as much confidence in Souter's commitment to conservative ideals, he recognized it would be easier to secure his confirmation for this lesser-known judge, and that is ultimately the decision that he made. When the opposition party controls the Senate, the president is also less likely to select a potential nominee with whom he is close friends to avoid accusations of cronyism. Instead, recall that presidents frequently take advice from senators, particularly those in leadership positions, when formulating the shortlist. When the president faces institutional constraints, he is more likely to heed the advice of congressional recommendations and appoint a nominee that has greater support from members of Congress. In addition to informational and political variables, there are other considerations that influence a president's selection decision. Presidents want to appoint justices to serve on the court long after they leave, so they prefer their appointees to be relatively young. However, remember that experience is a critical factor, especially in the Senate's confirmation decision, so the nominee can't be too young to raise suspicions that the nominee is not qualified. The average age for all the candidates included on the president's shortlist is typically just under 55, so it's not surprising that most nominees are in their 50s upon appointment. The president likely considers other electoral and partisan concerns as well. For example, historical patterns have been conscious of the geographical composition of the court, trying to make sure that each region in the country has some sort of representation. This regional concern has certainly lessened over time, but presidents still take demographic characteristics into consideration. For example, the senior President Bush, George H.W., faced intense political pressure to replace Thurgood Marshall with another African American, with a black justice, leading to the appointment of Clarence Thomas. And the second President Bush, George W., faced political pressure to replace Sandra Day O'Connor with another female, which contributed in part to the failed nomination of Harriet Miers. While undoubtedly systematic factors influence a president's selection decision, things like ideological compatibility, judicial experience, and institutional features, there are also undoubtedly always idiosyncratic features that are unique to each Supreme Court nomination because the political and social environment doesn't remain stable. As former Justice Sandra Day O'Connor once remarked, while there are many supposed criteria for the selection of a justice, when the eventual decision is made as to whom the nominee will be, that decision, from the nominee's viewpoint, is probably a classic example of being the right person in the right spot at the right time. Stated simply, you must be lucky. Most of our focus is on the judicial process at the Supreme Court level, but it's useful to understand some of the differences between the Supreme Court selection process and the appointment and selection of judges at other levels in the judicial hierarchy. The President is responsible for nominating judges to fill open seats in both federal district courts and within the courts of appeals. And while the President certainly considers some of the same factors as he does with Supreme Court nominations, especially ideology and party preferences of the candidate, the greater number of seats to be filled makes these appointments less politically and popularly salient. That's not to say that the President doesn't encounter challenges with Congress, which is something that we'll discuss next time. Interestingly, unlike its authority over Supreme Court nominations, the Senate Judiciary Committee exercises gatekeeping authority over lower federal court appointments. This means that if the committee rules that a lower federal court appointee is unfavorable, that appointment dies in committee and does not go forward to the Senate floor for a vote. While we'll see that the President accepts recommendations from high-ranking Senate members during the Supreme Court nomination process on occasion, senators have far more power in lower federal court appointments through an unwritten custom known as senatorial courtesy. Customarily, the President consults the senators, particularly those from his own political party, before nominating someone to fill a vacancy within the senator's state. This is especially common for federal district court appointments and is used to a lesser degree in the U.S. Court of Appeals. The Senate Judiciary Committee also displays deference to in-state senators, seeking senators' advice about district court nominees through something called the Blue Slip. Quite simply, for each district court appointee within their state, the senators submit a blue slip to the Senate Judiciary Committee that provides a favorable or unfavorable opinion of the nominee, and the Senate is likely to adopt that recommendation in their own voting procedure. The selection of state court judges varies quite considerably from the federal process. In 6 states, judges are selected either through gubernatorial or legislative appointment that actually is quite a close resemblance to the federal process, where the judge is appointed by the governor and confirmed by the state Congress. Conversely, some states select judges either through partisan or nonpartisan elections. In a partisan election, the judge actually runs on a party platform, while nonpartisan elections remove party labels. About 8 states have partisan elections and 13 states hold nonpartisan elections. The remaining states employ something called the Missouri Plan, which is commonly referred to as merit selection. The Missouri Plan was first introduced in the state of Missouri in 1940, which is where it gets its name, and the other states have adopted it at various points since then. Under a system of merit selection, a nonpartisan commission reviews potential nominees for a vacancy. This commission then sends a list of well-qualified candidates to the governor, who selects a nominee from this pre-constructed list. The selected nominee then begins to serve the judgeship until the next election, at which point the voters within a state vote to either retain the judge or remove the judge from office. If the judge does not survive the retention election, the process begins anew. It's notable that states also differ in their reappointment processes, where some states hold simple re-elections, still others have retention elections, while other judges must be reappointed by the governor. A few states even offer lifetime tenures to state judges. This is a simplified introduction to a very complex state court selection process, but it serves to show that there's variation in the selection processes of judges at the state and federal levels, where the selection of Supreme Court justices is the most politically and publicly salient. By way of quick review, because the Supreme Court decisions bind all of the other courts in the judicial hierarchy by determining what is and is not constitutional law, it has the greatest influence over law and policy. Changing the personnel on the Supreme Court through the appointment process then has significant influence over the direction of the court for years to come, and it is a process in which the President, the Congress, and various other interest groups are heavily invested. These issues will continue to unfurl in the coming weeks, but you should take a moment now to think about the types of factors that influence a president's decision when he or she is making a selection from their short list to replace a justice who's left a vacancy on the Supreme Court. As always, I encourage you to engage with me and your classmates on the discussion boards to consider potential nominees and how presidents would make these decisions. Until next time, I thank you as always for your attention.